Hello and welcome to AQA GCSE Sociology Research Methods. This is possibly the most important video of all of them and one of the most important elements of your exam. That's because all through both papers you will be expected to know and be expected to discuss research methods in a range of questions, not just in those specifically around items or the short answer questions where you're asked about a particular method or a particular sociologist, but also in the essays too. By doing so, you will easily gain more marks in your paper and you will reach a higher band and a higher level than you would have done without. So make sure you take careful notes. Decide if you want to use a spider diagram where you may want to divide sections into valid, reliable, practical and ethical and discuss each research method and sampling around those areas. You may want to divide a page into four. Talk about types of research, the measuring and recording of data, the strengths and weaknesses of each element, and the practical and ethical factors. That way, once you fill up a quarter, you won't need to take in any more information and it will keep you nice and concise. Lastly, make sure that you've got a cup of tea to hand, that you're relaxed, that you're ready to go, and that you can stop and start as you need to, rewind and go over certain parts of the paper. Research design. Self-explanatory, as a lot of things are, this is the designing of your research. So what key decisions would a sociologist or yourself have to make before undertaking the research? Have they established appropriate aims? So is it possible, essentially? Is it likely, is it feasible that what they're setting out to do can be achieved? If it's one person with a very limited budget and very limited time, for example, could they really get a representative research project off the ground? Probably not. And have they formulated a hypothesis? A hypothesis essentially means a guess. Have they predicted what they think they'll find? Have they shown why they think they'll find it? And then have they measured their findings against it when they do their evaluation? It are all elements of the research design that you may want to discuss. So this could be an area where you would have to critique certain research and talk about how well or how poorly it is designed and why. You may want to take in factors such as bias. This could include, does the person have a particular perspective? E.g., a feminist would have a gender bias and a Marxist would have a class bias, you may presume. Ethics, have they followed the codes of practice? Have they put anyone in harm? Have they protected their identity where necessary? Have they thought about the rights and wrongs of their research? And validity. How valid is the data? Does it give us a true picture? Is it merely quantitative and reliable, or does it show us really what society is like? So when you think about any kind of research, you may want to come back to the design and use that as an area to discuss to show that you understand what a sociologist has tried to achieve. The scientific method. This is an area of sociology and psychology that is particularly debated. Are these subjects actually a science? Are they anything like the natural sciences that you study, biology, chemistry, physics, etc.? So the scientific method sets out to study society as a biologist would study a plant or an animal, essentially, using non-biased observations and methods where essentially there is no form of putting a certain spin or a certain outcome onto what you're trying to find. So they may ask a question, do the research, they might come up with a hypothesis, perform their study of some sort, and then draw their conclusions. Now you may want to talk about, has their research then been peer reviewed? That can be important, particularly at university level, where other academics, other social scientists, other thinkers can look at it and give an opinion. Have they done a pilot study, a small scale study beforehand to check that their method works? Because if it doesn't work on a small group of people or a small sample, is it going to work on the general population? Is their research reliable or is it valid? Have they produced a lot of numbers and a lot of data where we can see patterns and trends? Or have they produced something that's more true picture, uses more anecdotal evidence perhaps, and draws conclusions from that to project onto the rest of society? So researchers using the scientific method obviously need informed consent. The people that they're researching must know what they're being researched for and how it might affect them. They must give their consent. And you must think about what are the interactions when you try and detach yourself as a scientist, how might that affect how people respond to you? and the answers that they give. Practical problems. Practical problems of research are very simple. Essentially, think of time and think of money. If an exam question asks you for practical problems, or there's an opportunity to talk about practical problems, how long did the research take? How long was spent on designing it? How much did it cost? What could have been done with more or less money? When we're assessing the success or failure of the research, it could be, does it tell us anything that's relevant now? Does it tell us anything that's relevant when it was done? It could be, is it fair? Is it honest? Have they used the right method and the right sampling frames? Have they looked at their own biases, perhaps? Have they set out to prove themselves right, or have they set out to merely study society? If they've used secondary sources, for example, Durkheim in the scientific method, when he used, say, crime statistics or suicide statistics, has he checked that they're reliable? Does he know where they're coming from? And the same with any element of crime, education, family, social stratification. If you're presented with statistics, for example, or a secondary source in the exam, are you able to say how that research was gathered, how that data was gathered, what was done? Could there be any holes or any issues with that? And when you talk about that in the exam, that will show the examiner you understand practical problems. Ethical problems. Along with practical factors, ethical problems of research are possibly the most important factors that you want to consider. So the British Sociological Association will have an ethical code. This will show sociologists in Britain how they are meant to conduct their research, how they're meant to present themselves and present what they're doing to other people. A lot of this will revolve around the idea of informed consent. Any participant should know what they're getting themselves into, should know any potential risks or hazards, and should be able to consent for themselves. Obviously, if any study involves children, that's one ethical concern around consent and the age of consent that you may want to talk about. This stems from the Nuremberg Code, which comes from the work of the Nazis, essentially in the Second World War. The Nazis conducted all sorts of experiments, medical, psychological, social, which were all around racial purity and a lot of ethical considerations, which were obviously abhorrent and disgusting once discovered to a lot of people. Therefore, the Nuremberg Code set out this idea, again, around informed consent and around not causing any harm. There may be a need for anonymity and confidentiality if you're working with people at risk of abuse or violence, if you're working with children, if you're working with anyone involved in crime as a victim or offender. You may need to protect their anonymity, which means perhaps changing their name, as someone like Hide and Zone would have done, or being confidential, not passing on information which may cause them harm further down the line. So you can see I've listed all of the things that you may want to consider in terms of ethical problems, such as informed consent, deception, the right to withdraw, protection from harm, debriefing afterwards, confidentiality, privacy, as areas when designing research and when considering the ethical problems you may want to talk about. In the exam, these are all things you can pick out from a particular piece of research or when talking in essays about certain subjects. So if you're asked to give advantages or disadvantages of a method that involves any vulnerable group, you may want to talk about ethical problems as an easy way to gain marks and show understanding. Primary sources. Primary sources is a fairly straightforward concept. It's any information a researcher has gathered themselves. It could be any research that produces quantitative data such as numbers, qualitative data such as opinions and thoughts, and this will then bring into it how reliable or how valid is the data. You may want to look at how representative it is of a population. Does it represent a population perhaps within your own class, within your year group, within your school, or is it on a grander scale such as the whole population of a country or society? This may then produce a case study. It could be from interviews, longitudinal studies, any method mixed together, such as observations, questionnaires. What you're really doing is you're assessing every part of it, every part that we've talked about so far, the practical, the ethical, the design, the method, and what that will produce. So Really, a primary source is any of the 25 studies that you need to know for the exam, you could argue. Secondary sources. Unlike primary sources, these have been compiled by somebody else somewhere. And these can be all types of material. They can be official statistics, they can be a website, a book, they can be an article. And really what you're looking at is, if someone's using a secondary source, have they done proper content analysis? When you're given a newspaper article to assess and to pick out the details, you are doing content analysis. You are using a secondary source. Now, some of the 25 studies that you've looked at will contain secondary sources. Durkheim using statistics, as mentioned before. We may look at, say, Goldthorpe being rejected in The Affluent Worker by Devine and how that comes together. Townsend is another Marxist who uses official statistics and official measures to come up with his theories and ideas. Throughout, Weber, when he's evaluating Marx, is using secondary sources, you may argue. So what you're really trying to assess in the exam is, have they used someone else's work? Have they been inspired by it? And has that influenced them in any way, positive or negative? Have they managed to take that into the proper context and show that their work isn't just biased in some way, either for or against the secondary source that person's using? Surveys. Surveys are probably the most common research method and the one that springs immediately to mind. You may have been stopped in the street and asked to carry out a survey. Obviously, there's an ethical consideration there if you're under 18. A survey could be done where you have a completely random sample or an opportunity sample, people just walking past, those who are willing to stop. The researcher may be instructed or may only want to stop certain demographics, females, males, age, ethnicity, whatever it may be. You have postal and online questionnaires where obviously the participant is filling those out without a researcher present. Telephone surveys, or any survey where, maybe even a webcam survey, a Skype survey, could be a new type of research, where if the researcher is present and is acting as an interviewer almost, and recording the data, you have an issue there. Have they ticked the right box? Have they recorded the answer accurately? Have they left anything out? Have they reworded it? So surveys come with what may seem to be a very simple research method, actually having quite a lot of areas that you can explore and talk about. So if you're presenting with the findings of a survey in the exam, you may want to question all of those things, as you would with any other method. The last thing you may look at is opinion polls. This can be something simple that you may see in an advert. 8 out of 10 people prefer such and such a product. Usually it's associated with politics though. Who is voting for who agrees with a certain policy, or sometimes even popularity, who likes a certain politician or leader or ruler. So surveys are everywhere, and the results of which can often be misrepresented to suit the media particularly. So be aware of that too when you're talking about them. Sampling. Sociologists use sampling because it can make research a lot more efficient, it can make research a lot more valid, a lot more reliable, it can really improve the quality of research. So a sampling frame is from where you take the sample. Which people do you have ready access to? Do you appeal to the general public? Are you in a certain group? Maybe a certain town, a certain institution such as a university or a school? Where do the people come from, and then who do you take from there to research? Who do you get to agree? So there are different ways of taking a sample. Quota sampling is where you take a quota of people. You need a set amount of people of a certain gender, age, ethnicity, class, whatever it is that you're researching, and you need to declare that and really make it clear that you are aiming to research a set group of people. A random sample, think of the survey in the street, people just walking up. Random sample is whoever's available essentially. And then think about how representative each sample is. Does it represent a certain group in a certain area? Is it very specific and very exclusive? Or is it really representative of a particular population or the whole population of a country? So it's really important that sampling is understood to be the selection of people, really. A snowball sample is the one which is often used by researchers, particularly if they're looking at things like crime, because it's recommendations. A participant recommends someone else who may be able to help, who may want to take part, or may not. And this can affect research in a positive or a negative way. So sampling is essentially how have they researched a particular idea, a particular group of people, how have they found those people, and how does that affect the results? That's what you're looking at here with sampling. Questionnaires. A questionnaire is a research tool, and it can be appropriate, but obviously it can be inappropriate too. The researcher is trusting participants to fill it in accurately, to fill it in honestly. And when you design a questionnaire, and you may have done this yourself, you may notice that how you phrase a question can be very leading. It may have grammatical errors in it. It may have words in it that the participant doesn't understand. If you're thinking about a particular group that may have a low literacy level, for example, whether that may be someone whose language whose second language is English perhaps, or something else, or young children, or someone with a low level of education, is a questionnaire appropriate for them? Questionnaires obviously have lots of advantages. They're quick, they're cheap, they're simple, they give reliable data, you can get a lot of analysis from them, you can find a lot of patterns and trends, particularly if they use closed questions, yes or no, for example. And they can have lots of easy ethical factors which make them very good research tools. They can be anonymous, they can be confidential. You can ask participants to tick, say, an age range rather than give specific details. So questionnaires are very practical, very, very often used by all sorts of people, not just sociologists, and there's a reason for that. Time and money, coming back to it, and the fact there's not really much chance of putting someone in danger, so the ethical considerations are a low priority for a lot of researchers. Therefore, if you're presented with the findings of a questionnaire or a research method where the researchers use questionnaires, you may want to consider those things when talking about it. Interviews. Interviews are a research method which are obviously very, very widely favoured by certain sociologists. Everybody remembers Paul Willis did interviews as well as observation. Obviously, the feminists looking at crime, they interviewed females as offenders and victims. Interviews as well favoured by interactionists because they're small scale generally. It's one-to-one often, or one interviewer with a small group of people. So the interview may be structured, it may have a set of questions. Think of that like a TV interview. You know, the presenter has a certain set of questions they have to ask the guest. Usually they don't deviate from that too much. An unstructured or semi-structured interview would allow for the participant to drive the conversation more. There may be open questions or no questions at all. It may be a chat which is recorded and the audio is then transcribed. This can be useful for advertisers who use focus groups or politicians who use focus groups to gauge the opinion of the wider public or certain demographics within the public. Interviewer bias can be an issue, particularly in unstructured interviews, where the interviewer may want to lead the person responding, and the person responding may want to give answers that they think the interviewer wants to hear. Obviously, interviewers can make research very valid. They can gauge a lot of opinion and thoughts. So interviews do have huge advantages for specific areas of research. So when you're asked the advantages or disadvantages or the application to certain areas, you may want to consider, is it best to interview a small group of people in this instance, or would you use a more reliable, more numerical, quantitative research method such as surveys, questionnaires, to get a larger number of people's thoughts and opinions. Observation. Observations are incredibly useful research methods, but obviously they're fraught with practical and with ethical considerations. So watching a group of people in their natural environment, for want of a better phrase, can really give an insight into what's going on with a certain area or issue in sociology. Again, we've just talked about Willis. Well, he used observations first and then followed those up with interviews. you've got a participant and non-participant. If you are sat at the back of the classroom as heroes, you're not participating. There's a barrier, there's a wall between you and your participants. Whereas if you think of, say, going undercover, as a police officer may do, to really get inside a group and pretend to be one of them, that sort of participant observation can be really rich and bring lots of detail out, but obviously there's more ethical considerations, such as deception, such as protecting confidence, anonymity, that kind of thing. And with that, you have the Hawthorne effect too, also known as the observer effect. If people know they're being watched, whether that's CCTV or an observer, or even an interviewer perhaps, they may modify their behaviour, they may modify their speech patterns and the content of what they say and do, because they feel that that will present them in the best light or give the best answers, when obviously the whole point is to get the most realistic and true picture. So any observations that you're presented with in the exam, any advantages, disadvantages questions, any essays where you may want to include talking about observations, think of all of those issues, bring those in to show that you understand them. Statistics. Statistics are probably one of the most important pieces of data for a sociologist. They're quantitative data, essentially, numbers. So any form of statistics, you're looking for patterns and trends, particularly over time. You may see these in family, in terms of marriage and divorce rates, most likely, exam results in education, choices of subject perhaps, and obviously crime, the dark figure and crime rates. Social stratification, you may see things like poverty, measures of income and wealth. The statistics can present any range of pictures, and you may have heard phrases such as talk of lies in statistics. Statistics are limited because they're just numbers. They don't show the true picture, they don't show the subtleties of opinions and ideas, and with that you have to be a bit careful. So remember, with statistics you're getting a limited picture, or you're getting a picture of lots of people over a vast range. This may be a range of time, a range of area, a range of population. So the statistics you're presented with, you need to think about, what do they actually show me? How have they been gathered? Who's gathered them? Are they reliable? Are they official statistics? Are they non-official? Are they done by a researcher of some sort? Where do they come from? Why have they been made? And all of this analysis, you can make reference to any of it to show your understanding, and that will be appropriate for the exams. Again, you will be given statistics in the exam to analyse, so it's really important you practice doing this and you look for ideas and patterns and you check that you can do this effectively. If a graph is going upwards or downwards, do you know if it's a positive or negative trend? Do you know what that shows? Does it miss out a group of people? Who's not there? Who's not represented by the statistics? That may be something that you want to consider too. Case study. The term case study comes from medicine. When doctors discover a particular disease or ailment, they will then make that into a case study. They record symptoms, they record treatments, they record what works, what doesn't work. Essentially, your whole GCSE is full of case studies. The different researchers that we look at and their work, they're all case studies of sorts. And we'll look at case studies in terms of particular news stories or items throughout the whole module. So you may think of, when we looked at Ruth Ellis and her execution, you may think of any findings, any particular area in society that perhaps something is wrong and it's being studied, such as Cohen's delinquent gangs, educational failure, gender bias, that kind of thing, social structure imbalances, social inequality. All of those case studies are things that you may want to consider. So when is it appropriate to use a case study? That entirely depends on the research aims. So you need to go back to research design. Who's doing it? What are they doing? Why are they looking at that particular case and not others? What does it show? The advantage is, obviously, there's a lot of data there already. There's a lot of secondary sources. There's a lot of information that you can compare over time with, and you can show change or you can show stasis, things staying the same. Think about someone like Marx, who was writing a long time ago. Well, you cannot expect him to predict the future. Similarly, all the other sociologists that are writing 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, etc., how much can you anticipate on their behalf? How much can you reasonably expect them to work through? So case studies have lots of advantages and disadvantages and can help back up a hypothesis or help disprove a hypothesis. So any case study that you get, you may want to think about, what is it telling me? Why have I got it in front of me? And then analyze it from that position. Longitudinal studies. Fairly easy to remember because it has the word long in it. So it's a study which may start when participants are very small or very young, and it may follow them for a period of years. Perhaps they're usually developmental, particularly in psychology, but you may see someone or groups of people being studied from a very young age all the way through to adulthood, and the researchers will go back at designated periods, every year, every 5 years, every decade. Obviously this can be an amazing depth of information, but it can also have lots of drawbacks. You know, a researcher may not finish it. They may not get participants that are willing to stay with a research project that long. So you may get a dropout rate which is much higher than other modules. Obviously, if you're looking at someone from a very young age, there's ethical considerations, there's ideas around consent, and perhaps you have to take into course their life course. You have to take into consideration they may go down certain paths or go through certain changes that make them no longer relevant, or they may not feel that they have anything to contribute anymore. Longitudinal studies, they obviously give lots of data and can be very valid depending on how the information is recorded. Things like social mobility can also change whether someone's really part of that study anymore. It may even make the study if it shows social mobility and meritocracy. So you need to think about, so much can change over time for that individual, for the researcher, for society. What impact can that have? And why is it important that we take that into consideration? So think longitudinal studies as lifetime studies almost. They go through a person's life, as it were, starting from a very young age until adulthood. They may start at young adulthood and go all the way through to old age. It's possible. And if there is a change in research or a handing over, what does that then mean? There can also be a change of focus, a change of hypothesis, which can impact heavily on the study too. Ethnography. Ethnography is closely linked to anthropology because it's the study of people in their natural environment. So often when we think of ethnography, we think of white, middle and upper class researchers going to far away, remote civilizations such as Papua New Guinea or the South Pacific, living on islands with groups of people that are very different and studying these. So you may see classic studies from the 20th century where gender is looked at by feminist researchers, particularly in cultures where male ideas around gender would appear more feminine to our eyes and vice versa. The ethnographic studies really may seem a bit antiquated. Now we have the internet, it may seem like, well, everything's been discovered. That isn't necessarily true. And also with ethnography, you have to consider that our white Western ideas, as it were, our modern ideas of that colonial era will have a huge impact. And in the advent of the internet, things may have changed. So technology could push certain groups of people and change how we study them and change the outcomes of ethnography. Obviously, huge advantages in that you're living in amongst a certain group of people that you're studying. So it links to observation there, particularly well, participant observation especially. So ethnographies really are perhaps seen as a thing of the past, but I don't believe that's the case. I believe that they've just changed their identity, perhaps because of technology and the world getting smaller, as it were. Experiments. As a form of research in sociology, they're not very common because the whole point of sociology is to study society. So taking people out of their natural environment, as it were, is kind of counterproductive. You may look at the picture and bring to mind the Milgram experiment, which is more associated with psychology. Or you may remember the Bobo doll experiment, where children were given a rubber doll which bounces around, and some were shown people being violent towards it and not being violent towards it, and then the children acted that out too. Obviously, with the Milgram experiment, giving electric shocks to an unseen person following authority, the influence of the Nazis there again coming in, is more to do with psychology. But they inform sociology really well. So it's important you do know about experiments and realise that it's unlikely you may get asked about them other than as a comparative method in the exam. So you can compare any research method to experiments and say, well, it's limited because of this, or it has that advantage. There's a lot of ethical problems with experiments. The Milgram experiment, trying to convince people they were killing someone else unseen and using actors to fake screams and fake deaths is highly controversial. Zimbardo in the Stanford prison experiment, you may know about, where students were locked in a basement and some were given sticks essentially and told they were the prison guards and the rest were told they were prisoners, and the violence and things that ensued there and the behaviour, very, very controversial. There's a lot of ethical problems with these experiments. So you may want to look at experiments as a way of taking people out of the social situation and seeing what changes. That could be the big advantage of experiments, rather than seeing if they reflect society and reality. Small-scale research. You will have done small-scale research either in this subject or other subjects if you've sent out any kind of survey or poll or looked into something. You've done some small-scale research. If you've gone around your classmates and asked an opinion, even a show of hands, technically that's small-scale research. And you may be looking for a general idea of attitudes. You may use things like questionnaires too, to make it a bit more formal and think about your questionnaire design. So a small-scale research is really similar to a pilot study perhaps, or is research which goes no further than a pilot study. It's anything done which affects a small group of participants and doesn't really lead on anywhere. So you could investigate different things as listed here: exercise and diet from different groups of people, education from different genders, different ethnicities perhaps, attitudes towards the welfare state, attitudes towards other classes, as it were. There's anything that you could do on a small scale within class itself, within school, within your year group, within the whole of the school, and that would be considered small scale research essentially. Once again, thank you very much for listening. I hope this has proved useful. This is one of the most important videos that I've made because it involves the whole of your exam, and there are many, many marks at stake when you're talking about research methods, and if you're able to use them comfortably, you will improve your grade without doubt. It may even go up 1 or 2 depending on what level you're at already. Use this again and again for both papers. Make sure that if you have any questions, you leave me a comment, you use a Google Classroom, email me directly, come and see me, and use the other resources that you have to make sure you fully get research methods. Thank you and good luck.